Our final guest is Troy Gajewski, who is a partner and co-chief investment officer of Skybridge Capital. It's a global investment firm that specializes in custom account portfolios, hedge fund advisory services, and a long-only mutual funds.
And Skybridge Capital is also a production partner and proud sponsor of Bold TV's coverage at the 2019 SALT Conference, which I'll be going to, a global thought leadership forum devoted to forming growth opportunities in the fields of finance, economics, entrepreneurship, public policy, technology, and philanthropy. All my favorite things.
Wow, welcome, Troy.
Yeah, great to be here. Well done. I like that promo.
Thank you. All right, so let us know a little bit about your role at Skybridge.
Oh, so at Skybridge, so I'm one of our co-chief investment officers. My job is primarily to generate investment themes where we're seeing opportunity globally for investors to make a reasonable high single-digit return without too much downside risk. And so a lot of the job is research. Also, I get to interact with a large number of our clients, which I really enjoy as well.
There's a couple of things here that have had my brain ping. One is you talked about theme, which I've never really heard investments spoken of in that way. And the other is you're talking about single digit return, which isn't what we always think of when we think of a hedge fund. We think of high risk and high return, which is usually double digits. So share a little bit about that.
100%. So the first thing I would say in terms of themes, it has been used before. I don't think we came up with it ourselves. That being said, our whole investment process is based on finding inefficiency, which leads to opportunity. And so a very simple example would be coming out of the financial crisis, home prices had dropped dramatically, and the mortgages that were backed by the houses were very, very cheap. And so that was one theme, playing the recovery of mortgage-backed securities. We have many others, but that's how we define it. It's a big part of our success historically. We think it's the biggest differentiator we have between others in our industry. Now, look, in terms of, I apologize, what was the second question?
So we think of mutual funds as high risk, high return, and you're talking hedge funds. Thank you. Hedge funds, and you're talking about single digits, and that seems to be a little different idea around the hedge fund strategy.
Yeah. So unfortunately, you know, as our founder Anthony Scaramucci says, the press likes to talk about the guy who stole $1 billion, made $1 billion, or lost $1 billion, right? and the majority of institutions and high net worth or trade union investors like we have, fire pension plans, endowments. They really want to just generate a consistent high single-digit return without the risk of losing a substantial amount of their principal in the next recession or bear market, or if something goes wrong overseas or there's a major shock. So, you know, if your greed hat is on too much, as some investors unfortunately have on now or in the late 90s, or think back to the housing market in 05, 06, if you're too focused on greed and you're really trying to hit mid-teens returns, we can just about guarantee you're going to have a substantial loss over the next 5 to 7 years. The math just doesn't work. There are no assets that compound in the teens over an extended period of time. And so by compounding wealth, by protecting your principal and gradually compounding wealth, at the end of the day, that puts you in a much better place for retirement and also to make, you know, the checks that you have to as an endowment or as a pension plan.
So Troy, this conference attracts a lot of people. The guest list is very impressive. Also, Jewel is doing a concert at this.
Wow.
I mean, you're talking.
I'm very excited.
You're talking about. I love Jewel. You know, but there's a lot of,
right?
All right. You know, there's a lot of these themes seem like, you know, very institutional and very serious, but there's a lot of famous people coming.
Well, it's a lot of fun. So the whole idea that Anthony and his team had when we started this 10 years ago was to try to bring a cross-section of people from politics, from national security, from entertainment, and see if there could be, you know, simplistically cross-fertilization of ideas. And it's been, you know, a smashing success over time. We're very excited about it this year. I mean, from my perspective, I really enjoy the political angle, you know, and the national security angle. So, for instance, Ambassador Nikki Haley's coming this year, and she's a fascinating background, as you know. And what I find so interesting is she could be the first major candidate, major party presidential candidate we've had ahead of time, right? Because typically we have people as their careers are ending. She's in a transition now and maybe, you know, running for the Republican nomination in 2024. General John Kelly, who's a very candid speaker about the things he agreed with at the Trump administration, but also that he disagreed with. We have Valerie Jarrett and Susan Rice.
Yeah, you have people from both sides. That's what's interesting.
We try to
like
keep it
that.
totally bipartisan, so there's no partisan bias. And then the entertainment side, or even national security, when you have guys like General Petraeus or Admiral McRaven, Jewel, John Fogerty, it throws a little fun, but at the same time, you get to understand how much of the resources of the country are invested to protect us, which I think a lot of us, when you live on the coasts, sometimes forget about all the sacrifice that servicemen give.
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting forum because people from a certain cross section and talking really about the general economy and how to keep our investments safe.
That's right.
And how to move ahead.
Yeah.
But also kind of the interaction between public policy and Wall Street,
That's
which
right.
a lot of people fail to make that connection, that what the government does matters for investors.
Yes.
It's funny. So one of our clients the other day in a meeting, I was out in Menlo Park, and I'll tell you this story. They said, you know what? In 2006, if I walked into a client meeting and talked about the Fed, you wouldn't even pay any attention. If I walked into a client meeting and said, here, I'm going to tell you what the Bush administration is going to be doing to affect the economy, no one even thought about that. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending how you look at it, the policies coming out of D.C. are more important than they've ever been, in our humble opinion. Additionally, the way the Fed can change direction and how it impacts assets, critically important. So if you're not plugged in and have we think a thoughtful view on the potential direction of DC policy and Fed policy, you're going to have a very hard time generating, again, high single-digit returns without taking too much risk, which is so critically important.
Yeah, and one of these policies, as Holland's going to discuss it, are opportunity zones.
That's right. We'll have Dr. Ben Carson there. We're very
so
excited about that.
Talk to us about that. So what are opportunity zones, and why is this a key topic at the SALT conference?
Yeah, so opportunity zones, if you think of what this country's always tried to do with very admirable intent, is in order to reduce areas of poverty or a lack of economic opportunity, what we've done is a series of transfer payments. We take from higher earners, we take from successful businesses, and we transfer that wealth, and that has not alleviated the problem. So the whole idea with opportunity zones is to try to get capital formation, to try to drive private capital, private businesses, private real estate investment into these economically disadvantaged zones. And back to the bipartisan side, I really, so it was Senator Rick Scott and Cory Booker working on this together.
Whoop.
Yeah.
Very different people.
And I really love the way Cory Booker sums it up the best. These are emerging markets in the United States. And so what the government has allowed in the tax reform, this was put in the tax reform bill as a pro-growth reform, is to allow investors to take a capital gain, and if they roll that into a qualified opportunity zone, which has certain standards in terms of median income below the average for the area, 20% poverty rate or greater, if they do that, they can defer their tax payment on the initial gain until 2027. And if you invest before the end of this year, you have a 15% forgiveness. If you invest before the end of 2021, you have a 10% forgiveness. So that's a powerful motivation if you're looking at a large gain on a stock, or some of the people that maybe got into Bitcoin early that went, before it blew up, right? Hey,
a very specific Bitcoin timeline. They sold about a year ago.
Exactly. Usually we talk about that as a classic bubble, right? But in this case, if you got it early enough, you probably did have some gains. Roll that in. So that's one powerful incentive. The other part is if you hold the underlying investment, whether it be in a business or a real estate, you can actually have no capital gain after 10 years, which is tremendous from a standpoint of return. And so the way we think about it is it's a classic, if you teach a man to fish, you can feed him for his life. Mm-hmm. And so you're trying to drive capital formation. If you give a man a fish, he feeds for an evening, right? And so that's the whole objective here. And we'll see if it works, but I think obviously Senator Booker, Senator Scott, others, Mnuchin, they've spent a lot of time developing the plan. It looks very promising so far. And we're very excited to have it featured at SALT this year.
So let's talk about metrics for success. A lot of people say, oh, you're driving all this money into poor areas. Mm-hmm. It's going to lead to gentrification, et cetera. And how do we even measure success? It's really hard. Public policy, I have a master's in it. Yes. This is what I do, right? Usually when you measure the impact of a policy, it's 20 years later. Mm-hmm. So it's very hard to tell whether this was a good plan or not. Why do you think it is a good plan, and what do you say to people who are worried about gentrification and pushing people out of certain areas?
Well, look, I think we can all agree that what's been tried historically has had some success in taking people out of the basis level of poverty and making sure that they have enough food to consume and have shelter to some extent. Although obviously there's failures even in great cities like New York. It's very hard to make sure every single person has a roof over their head and is eating a balanced diet. So I think we conclude for the most part we've meet the basis needs, but we've never driven some of these areas to have self-sufficient economic activity. And so when you think about this plan, you are taking private capital, private investors, motivated individuals that are going to try to find a way to make businesses work in zones that have been challenged, and also to build not only Class A gentrified space, but also workforce housing, which is a huge push of this plan.
Which we desperately need.
We desperately need. It's really insane. So the government's tried a variety of plans for workforce housing. It is very hard to get a developer to say, I'm not going to build that Class A space. I'm going to build brand new Class B. But this is another advantage of the opportunity zones, is because of the tax incentive, they'll more than likely be incentivized to do so. Ultimately, we think that the two biggest areas where you could have success are tied to logistics, which is the new catch-all phrase for warehouses, shipping.
Sure.
There are quite a few. And the idea there is that you're going to drive long-term, high-paying jobs, right? And then in terms of buildings, again, we would look to measure success if somewhere around half of the new building could be somewhere tied to Class B or workforce housing. If it ends up being all Class A and luxury hotels, not as exciting as if we can get Class B. And again, time will tell. The devil's in the details. There's no perfect solution, but at least this has a chance to improve these areas.
And to David's point, do we have some sort of time frame and timeline, and do we have metrics, 5 years out, 10 years out, that we're looking for that will give us an idea of success or not?
Well, yeah, so on the investment for the real estate side, they'll be looking at GDP growth, tax revenue growth, per capita income growth. For instance, if you start in a zone that has 22% poverty rate, if you can drive that down to 15, over a 10-year
That's a huge
win.
That's a win. Yes.
Exactly. And look, maybe it's only 18, but that's a huge difference, 4%, right? If you can drive the average immediate income from, say, 75% of the surrounding area up to 90%, huge win. And back to your point on criticisms on gentrification, we totally hear that. Every government program, isn't perfect. There is going to be slippage. There are some zones that probably at this point shouldn't be zones, but they're based on the 2010 census. So no government plan is perfect, but we think there's a real measures of tangible success, driving down poverty, increasing average median income in the area, the two that we'll be looking at, because again, those are the two that define an opportunity zone.
Yeah, Florida did a pretty good job. I'm a resident of Florida, and the zip codes that are included in opportunity zones are pretty distressed.
Yeah, and same with Connecticut. I mean, if you look through the Bridgeport area, parts of Norwalk, I mean, these are all areas that have struggled, right? And some are advantaged because they're closer to the Metro North, but once you get too far away from the Metro North, very hard to simulate development. And so, back to your point, wouldn't it be great if we sit down here 10, 15 years and we've reduced the number of opportunity zones by 20 or 25% because of this program? Meaning you've lifted that many people out of poverty, you've lifted average median income enough that they no longer would qualify as opportunity zones if you did the test again today.
Well, that's a great way to end, Troy. And
we're optimistic at
and I will be at SALT.
All right, great.
With
I will
bells
see you
on.
there.
We will see you there. Thank you so much for joining us.